Well, welcome to another Friday night. We're continuing our series on reparenting, that healing from complex trauma is really the process of parenting ourselves and meeting needs that weren't met as we were growing up, learning tools that we weren't taught so that we can handle the stresses and pressures and responsibilities of life in healthy ways. Today I want to come to a part of reparenting that is a difficult topic for many, and that is eating disorders. And you may have your own eating disorder, and so your recovery requires reparenting yourself and learning how to deal with that eating disorder, or you may have a child who has an eating disorder. So this could be a very painful topic to think about, but it's an important topic to think about. If you were to do just some checking on the internet about eating disorders, there's tons of information. But what you're basically going to find is, in most cases, it's considered as a mental illness. Something's wrong with their brain. And it's got one of the highest death rates, or it does have the highest death rate for mental illnesses. So that's discouraging right up front. Then you're going to read that it's extremely difficult to treat with very low success rates, another very discouraging thing. And then you're going to find all kinds of different opinions about what causes eating disorders. So what I want to do with you tonight is just give you where some of the research is going, where research is now taking place. Over the last bit, there's been more and more emphasis put on researching whether there's a connection between eating disorders and complex trauma. And I find that quite fascinating. And from my experience in this field, I would say, yes, there is a connection. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is the connection between complex trauma. That complex trauma sets a child up where they see eating disorder as a solution to what they're feeling inside, the pain that they can't resolve. And so eating disorders are a symptom in some people of complex trauma issues. And so the way to help the person is not just focus on the eating disorder, though you got to do some of that, but it's also to focus on the complex trauma, to get to the root issues behind the eating disorder. So I'm not giving this talk wanting to beat people up, to try to make people feel guilty. I want to do this to give clarity, to help people begin to think about eating disorders in a way that would hopefully lead to solutions that are going to be more effective, dealing with the real issues. And hopefully you're going to find this helpful. So let me just begin with what is probably the most well-known, and that's just what kind of eating disorders are there. And there's basically categorized under 3 categories. So anorexia nervosa is the most commonly known one, and that is defined by a person with very restrictive eating patterns, a person who has an intense fear of gaining weight or persistent behaviors of avoiding gaining weight, despite the fact that they're already underweight. And then this relentless pursuit of thinness, which means they're unwilling to maintain a healthy body weight. And then their self-esteem is greatly affected by their body weight or their perceived body shape. And so all of it is tied into a distorted body image, and that includes denial of being seriously underweight. So that's anorexia nervosa. You restrict your food in unhealthy ways. Then there's bulimia nervosa. And that occurs when someone is repeatedly binging on large amount of foods and then purging it. The purging behaviors can come from forcing themselves to throw up, but it doesn't have to just include that. For others, their purging behaviors includes over-exercising, using diet pills or laxatives. Both binging and purging behaviors have elements of danger. They are very hard on the body, and so it can very quickly lead to some dangerous physical symptoms for people. Then there's a third category called pica that in many cases in the past has been associated with being pregnant. That pregnant people all of a sudden have cravings for foods that are not really foods. Eating disorders can include pica, which means eating foods, not foods that have no nutritional value. So it's somebody that eats dirt or chalk or soap or paper or cardboard, or they eat hair or cloth or wool or stones or laundry detergent or cornstarch. It's just they have these cravings for foods that are not foods, have no nutritional value. Next, let's go to how do you tell? What are warning signs, indicators that a person has an eating disorder? And so there's mental, behavioral signs that may include a dramatic weight loss, a concern about eating in public, all of a sudden becoming very preoccupied with food, with calories, with their weight, with the number of grams of fat, with dieting, or complaints about being constipated, or cold all the time and not tolerating cold, or abdominal pain, or just lethargy, just no energy, or excess energy. Or they can make excuses to avoid mealtime, or intense fear of gaining weight or getting fat, as they would describe it. Or they would wear layers of clothes, and that's either to hide their weight loss from other people or to help them stay warm. Or they can severely limit or restrict the amount of food that they consume, or they can refuse to eat certain foods that they've eaten in the past, foods that are fairly healthy, or they can deny feeling hungry, or they can express regularly the need, I need to burn off calories, or repeatedly weighing themselves, patterns of binge eating and then purging, developing rituals around food, excessive exercising even in the middle of the night, cooking meals for others but then not eating themselves, missing their menstrual period. That can begin to happen as the eating disorder progresses. Having difficulty concentrating all of a sudden, or fits of dizziness or fainting. Problems with sleeping that begin to happen. Some develop calluses on the tops of their fingers, and that would be from sticking their finger down their throat to induce vomiting. Others, you begin to notice that their skin really dries out, or their fingernails get very dry and thin, or their hair begins to get thinner and fall out. Others, they begin to experience more muscle weakness, or they don't heal as well if they get cut, or they get sick more often, easier. Their immune system isn't working as well. So 27 indicators that a person may have an eating disorder. And you would need a number of those to begin to get quite suspicious. Now, I want to take this in a direction maybe you've never heard of or thought of before. Dr. Laura Hill is a real expert whose whole practice is around eating disorders and helping people with eating disorders. And she presents a lot of good research on the brain of a person with an eating disorder versus the brain of a person who doesn't struggle with an eating disorder. And it's very interesting to see the differences in the brain. So let me just see if I can summarize it for you. A person who doesn't have an eating disorder, who has a healthy relationship with food, if you were to look into their brain, you would come down in the center of their brain to the insula, which is the part of the brain that creates the sensation of hunger and gives us a sense of taste. Okay? So we get the sensation of hunger, and then we eat. Then the amygdala is ready. And the amygdala is looking for, is this food safe? Is this food good? Am I enjoying it? It's processing all of that information. And if it senses something's not right with this, it tastes bad, it tastes rotten, it's sour, it has no flavor, it's got alarm systems that are going off. If it's very good, then we get the next system that engages, which is the dopamine system, the pleasure, reward system. So we get pleasure from the taste of the food, number one. And then once we feel satisfied or full, we get pleasure from that satiated feeling. So dopamine is released at the taste of the food, at the satiated feeling, and then that dopamine makes me want to eat again in the future. Because there's a reward for eating now. There's pleasure that comes out of eating. But then there's a fourth part of the brain that it engages, and that's the cortex. And it's the monitor of all that is happening in the other systems. And so, as you eat and it is satisfying and you're getting pleasure, the cortex is weighing out, should I have a bit more? Well, am I feeling full? Have I had enough calories today? Is this really healthy food, or is this just junk food that I'm enjoying? So it's weighing out a whole bunch of things to determine, do I have more food or have I had enough? And then part of that is an even bigger picture of how have I been doing in my relationship with food lately? Have I been struggling with overeating a little bit? Have I been eating my emotions due to stress lately? So it's processing all of that. The other thing that then happens with the cortex is it's developing memories around food. So it says, wow, whenever I have lobster, I just love it. That gives me more pleasure than anything. So now I have a memory of that. So the next time I'm going out and I know I'm going to have lobster, my cortex is already anticipating that and releasing dopamine and anticipation even before I've tasted the lobster, because it knows how much it enjoys lobster. So there's all kinds of systems in the brain that are involved in the eating process. And that's just a quick overview of the healthy brain of a person with a healthy relationship with food. Now let me take it to a person with an eating disorder. And this is so important to understand. Number one, the insula, it has no sensation of hunger. It doesn't create a sensation of hunger. Secondly, for many people with an eating disorder, they don't have any sense of really powerful taste. A lot of the food they eat tastes like cardboard. They don't get their taste buds stimulated like a normal person would. So the insula, again, is affected by that. Well, that then gets communicated to the amygdala, and it's a little bit confused. And it's a little bit on guard because, okay, there's no flavor here. There's nothing positive coming from the insula. I can't taste it very much, so I don't know if it's good for me, bad for me, healthy, tastes good, could be poison. So it's kind of feeling cautious. Then we're going to get to another system in a little bit that's connected to CT, but then you go to the third system, dopamine. Well, there's no dopamine being released because there's no pleasure from taste, and there's no pleasure from feeling full because you're not hungry. So you're not getting your reward system happening. Well, then that takes you to your cortex, and now it's confused because it's not having any good experiences from this. It doesn't know what to put into memories. And so the only thing that it can really gain from all of this is food is not a positive thing. Food isn't necessarily something that needs to be repeated. So maybe it's better not to eat. So that in and of itself shows you how different the brain is working. But then there's another system. And this is the one to me that is influenced the most by complex trauma. But this is a system that we refer to as the brain noise, or the brain disturbances, or the brain chatter. That's going on in the brain of a person with an eating disorder. And the point is that it is very loud racket. There's a lot of static brain chatter going on. There's a lot of voices, negative voices that are going on inside of a person with an eating disorder. So if that person is sitting just at home alone by themselves on a normal day, they're going to have some brain chatter. That brain chatter is going to talk about that they're fat, that nobody's going to accept them, nobody's going to love them. It's going to be very much shame messages that are all focusing around their body, their weight. Then, if they're going to go out to a social event, the brain chatter drastically increases. And with it, huge anxiety. So now the brain chatter is, you're going to meet people, they're going to see you, they're going to think you're fat, they're going to think you're ugly, nobody's going to want you. And it just goes. And then the anxiety of then going to meet with those people is through the roof. Then if you go to that social setting, and now it is time to sit down and eat, the brain chatter and anxiety become deafening. Your brain is just roaring with this noise that you're taking a bite of food, you're fat, nobody's going to want, it just becomes so loud that it's hard to focus, it's hard to hear conversations. So, what does the limbic brain conclude is the solution to this problem? I can't live with this anxiety. I can't live with this loud brain chatter. So the solution is don't eat. That takes the anxiety away. That takes the brain chatter pretty much away. I still get a little bit, but I can at least function. I can at least focus on my homework. But when the brain chatter gets to a certain point, when the anxiety gets to a certain point, I can't focus at school. I can't do my homework at home. I'm useless. So don't eat. So don't eat becomes the solution to the critic in their brain that is so loud and so vocal and produces so much anxiety. So this, to me, is such an important part to understand. So that takes us to then, okay, let's try to put into words the cause of this loud brain chatter that is causing a person to feel fat, that is causing anxiety around food, that is causing a huge mental chatter whenever they're around people and food. To me, it's the complex trauma. But like I did last week, I want to put this into this context. Parents, what is their part in a child having an eating disorder? That's really kind of what it boils down to in the discussion of causes. Are the parents, do they have any responsibility, or is this just some mental illness that a kid got by fluke and the parents had nothing to do with it? Or is this something maybe they got a gene from the parents and that's the only responsibility of the parents? What I want you to see is I think the research more and more is beginning to show that that inner critic in the brain that creates all this brain chatter and shame, feeling fat, feeling not good enough, that came from the home. That came from the messages the child received, both by how the parents lived, by what they said, by how they treated the child, by comments that were made. And then living in a society that puts all the emphasis on body and image, just fed into that. And so again, I'm not saying this to try to beat parents up. I just want you to understand, if you're going to help your child, you need to understand your part in setting them up for it so that you can change, so that you can create a home where they're not getting those messages reinforced. Then they have a chance of healing and working on the issues that came out of that. So, let me show you and take this whole complex trauma piece a little bit further. So the first one to me is quite fascinating. We do know that trauma has the capacity to shut down powerful systems inside of us. So what we're talking about with eating disorders is we have this powerful survival system called hunger. Hunger creates this need, this powerful force to go and get food. Eating disorder shuts down that positive, powerful force inside of a person. Can trauma shut down powerful forces? So let me give you complex trauma. So trauma creates two powerful forces: fight, flight. Get out of here quickly or fight for all you can. But what happens if a child is 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old? They are too small to fight or to flight. A deeper trauma takes place, and that shuts down the powerful forces of fight or flight, and it kicks in opioids in the brain that overpower the cortisol, and they freeze. So trauma is able to shut down extremely powerful systems inside of us. Another part that is very powerful in all of us is the power of our emotional world. Anger pulls us to want to do a certain thing. Fear pulls us to want to do a certain thing. Happiness pulls us to want to do a certain thing. Loneliness pulls us. All kinds of emotions have powerful pulls on us. What happens with complex trauma? I can't follow through on those powerful pulls to lead to a resolution, so I'll shut down my emotions. I will disconnect from my emotions so that I don't feel. Wow. Trauma can shut down the emotional world. It can result in dissociating from emotions. That's how powerful trauma is. It overrides the most powerful systems in the body. Then there's oxytocin. So when a person has fear, oxytocin floods the brain, which makes you want to run to a strong person so they can protect you. But what happens in complex trauma? If you have oxytocin flood your brain and you run to mom or dad for protection and they smack you and say, toughen up. All you now realize is oxytocin creates in me a pull that leads to more pain. And so a person in complex trauma has a greater trauma, which is, if I give into this pull, I'm going to get into more pain, so I'm going to shut down my oxytocin system. And they do. And they don't care. And it's an amazing thing. So complex trauma can shut down fight, flight. It can lead to dissociation and shut you off from your emotions, and it can shut down oxytocin. It can also shut down hunger. It has the capacity to shut down that powerful system. So that's so important to understand. It can affect the insula's desire or hunger sensation. Secondly, what happens in complex trauma is a child's needs aren't being met. They have pain that is not being resolved. Nobody's helping them with. Nobody's protecting them, keeping them safe. And so they go, it's my fault. And they end up with, I'm not good enough. Then they listen to their families, they listen to their culture, and they go, the way to have love, be loved, the way to have value is to have a perfect body, is to be a perfect weight, is to be beautiful. And so in their brain, they go to, if only I wasn't as fat, if only I had a better body, then I'd be loved, then I'd be okay. And so now their shame looks for its solution in their body weight. And that then means they have to control their food. And so shame means I must find value outside of who I am. I must now find it in my body or in how others look at my body. So that becomes the driving force of much of eating disorders, is that shame piece which comes out of complex trauma. And then there's another part for some is, for them complex trauma is parents are trying to control them. Their parents are control freaks. And so the one way that they can get a little bit of control in their life is an eating disorder. And their parents can't control that. Or they've got so much chaos in their life, they feel out of control with their emotions, they feel out of control in how they respond to things, but the one area they can control is their food, so that gives them a little bit of a feeling of control, of being on top of things. It takes them out of all of that chaos for a little while. So they become hyper-focused on controlling their food as a way to gain some sense of stability. So complex trauma can drive eating disorders big time in major ways. So let me go to healing. So there's really two levels that you have to think about when it comes to healing. So the first is helping a person with an eating disorder deal with their current situation. The second is helping a person with an eating disorder deal with the underlying shame, deal with the underlying complex trauma stuff. Both are necessary. And so again, what we do in our LIFT program and our REACT program is help people deal with all of that underlying stuff so they have tools to deal with the eating disorder. But let me take you to what Dr. Laura Hill talks about in helping a person with an eating disorder. So the first is this. See your food like a medication, like a medicine that you have to take. So basically it's this. I need to take my medicine. I know it's not going to taste good. I know I'm going to have some side effects after I take my medicine, but bottom line, it will help me. So if you can get your brain to begin to see food like medicine, and that medicine doesn't taste good and it has some side effects, but it does help, that can help you. Secondly, if you have somebody with an eating disorder, don't say, just eat and you'll feel better. That's not true to them. That might be true to you, but that's not true in their world. The truth is, if you eat, you're not going to feel better. You're probably going to feel worse. It's going to be painful. It's going to make your anxiety worse. It's going to make your brain chatter worse. So, for you to get healthy is you're going to have to start eating, but what I want you to understand is it's actually going to feel worse for a while. And that could actually go on for quite a while before you actually start to see the brain chatter decrease, the anxiety decrease, and you actually start to have some feelings of hunger and enjoyment of food. So this is going to be a bit of a journey. The next thing, in looking at it like a medicine, is to plan your medication and your doses. So plan your meals. So at this meal, here's my medicine. I'm going to have this food at this amount. Here's my next dose, this food, this amount. Here's my next dose, this food, this amount. Plan it out like you would plan your medication. Okay, now let me go to a bigger picture. Number one, don't look to magically fix it or find a magic solution. If this is coming out of your complex trauma shame stuff, that's going to take a while to heal. So what you're looking for right now is not a magic fix, but you're learning to manage your symptoms so that you are finding a way to eat, take your medicine, so that you are getting physically better as you deal with the emotional stuff. Okay, big picture, work on the deeper issues. Work on the complex trauma. Remember that the eating issues are symptoms of the deeper issues, so work on the shame. And again, I would say that one of the things that Lift and React offer that a lot of programs don't is a very thorough, detailed help to people with shame value issues. So consider that. Here's a practical thing that might be helpful to you. That inner critic, that brain chatter, give that voice a name so that it's separate from you. And then when you hear that voice, talk to it. Confront it. Ask it what it's afraid of. Ask why it's saying that. Begin having conversations with that. That helps a lot of people begin to realize, okay, that's not really me. That's Charlie. And that's Charlie is really something from my past that's still stuck in my head that I'm dealing with. Then learn to identify that voice's lies. And then challenge those lies. Now here's where this is leading, and this is the crux of it. You see, what you've done to now is that internal critic, so Charlie, in your brain, you've trusted, you've listened to, you obeyed. It's had all the power. Now you're challenging Charlie. Now you're realizing Charlie's been lying to you. Charlie's been operating out of fear. But I need to now trust a new voice. I need somebody who I know is telling me the truth that I can trust. That is difficult. That is a challenge. That's where a battle can take place with a lot of people. But that's what it boils down to. Am I going to keep trusting Charlie, or do I choose to trust a new voice that I've checked out, I believe is telling the truth? If that new voice is telling the truth and you trust it and follow it, Charlie will lose his power. And that new voice will gain in power. And then you will see some real changes begin to happen. Another practical thing. If you have people in your life that keep feeding your shame, that say you're too fat, you're too thin, you're no good, nobody's going to want you, who are very critical of you, you're going to need boundaries with those people. Because as long as you're hanging around those people, hearing them, they're feeding that internal critic. They're feeding Charlie. So boundaries is going to be an important part of this. So people who trigger you, boundaries. Next thing, what happens with an eating disorder is your whole identity gets wrapped up in food, in your weight. Give yourself permission now to start finding out who you are apart from food. So important to begin finding out who you really are, to expand your identity. Somebody has said this, and it leads to the next thing, that anybody dealing with a eating disorder, you need patience. The journey of recovery is not an easy one, but in moments of wanting to give up, we must remind ourselves that it will never be an instant change. We must appreciate the slow and steady growth that we are working towards. Giving up is never worth it. We must take pride in our small accomplishments that in time become the greatest. Now, what I thought I'd do is we have on our lift staff a lady named Debbie who's struggled with an eating disorder, and I've asked her if she would share her story and what she learned in her healing journey. It's really well done. I hope that you will enjoy it.
Hi, my name is Debbie, and before coming to Tim Fletcher's program, Lift Online, I struggled with overeating. I hadn't always struggled with overeating. I had some issues around food. However, I had another primary addiction. And what happened for me was in 2007, I got sober from my primary addiction. And I didn't quite realize it at that time. But what was happening, I would do the 12 steps. When you get to step 4, you start taking an inventory. So you start taking an inventory of your behavior, your past, your relationships. And as I was going through that process, a lot of emotions were coming up for me, caused a lot of anxiety, caused a lot of distress. So I would eat, and that would comfort me. So I didn't quite make that connection. All I knew was I was getting sober in one program, and I was quite happy with that. And I didn't realize how I kind of just switched addictions and started going to food whenever I was feeling anxiety or um, anything I didn't really want to feel. I'd always had anxiety, so I had learned to cope with it in many unhealthy ways throughout the years. But in the past couple of years, it was mostly food that I would use to deal with my anxiety. What I didn't realize was that there was something deeper going on with my addiction that was still driving me to still have an addictive personality. Whenever life got too hard, I didn't always have coping tools. So I would go to something to numb. I would go to something to take that edge off. I would go to something to stop my mind from going. And I kind of thought that it was okay. So I didn't really understand that I was still using food the same way I was using my primary addiction. Similar to my primary addiction, I started noticing how it was some of the things I would do were very similar. The things that would go on to my in my head. For example, I'd kind of say, okay, today I'm going to go to work. I'm going to go home. I'm going to have a healthy meal. I'm not going to overeat, and I'm not going to have these multiple snacks in the evening. And then I'd go home, I'd eat, I would just sit on the couch. I'm not going to do this. And I would find myself doing exactly what I said I wouldn't do. Next day, feeling shame about it, not liking how I'm not able to not do what I say I'm going to do. Next day, same thing. I'm kind of, thinking through how I want to live my day, yet I just can't get myself to do what I had planned on doing. It was as if there was another part of me taking over, which for me felt very similar um, to my first addiction. So I kind of had this idea that, well, to lose weight, I need to eat less and I need to move more. And the more I tried to lose weight, the more weight I would put on. I would get into these places, like even if I had an idea in the morning, how I wasn't going to overeat in the night. When I got to that space, that place at night, it was almost like I didn't care. Everything that I felt in the morning, the shame that I felt, the guilt that I felt, all of that would disappear in the evening. And it's like I didn't care because I just needed the food so that I could feel better. So I got to the place where I really couldn't stop. So I equate that to addiction, whether it's addiction to alcohol, drugs, food, sex. For me, the food really became something that no matter what I tried, I couldn't stop. I remember going to a shopping center. I needed to get some clothes for a new job I was starting, and I needed to go to a plus size store. And I remember being very upset that I needed to do that. And when I tried on the clothes, and I looked at myself in the mirror, I couldn't believe how big I was, and I started to cry. I remember just crying in the changing room, looking at myself and thinking, "How did I get here?" And how am I going to get out of this? There was so much shame about how I looked, and so I really thought at that time that, well, if I could just lose this weight, I wouldn't feel the shame. So that first experience with losing weight was really about I don't want to feel shame anymore. So I'm going to lose this weight, and I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to feel this anymore. So I looked at my life. I looked at what worked, and I saw 12 step that worked for my primary addiction. I'm going to go and do a 12-step program around my food. So I got on that, and I worked it exactly as they told me to. I ate the food that they wanted me to eat. I would even I weighed and measured my food to the point where I would bring a scale to a restaurant and I would weigh my salad being in a restaurant. And it just kind of got to that place that I was desperate and I just needed to get rid of this weight. And for me, that meant I needed to get rid of the shame. So I lost 86 pounds. So I was at a great white weight, even less than I had been in like many, many years. So at that weight, I was able to keep it off for 5 years. And what I see now, why I was able to do that was keeping busy. So that kind of put another addiction into play. So I was able to be so busy in my program that every time I wanted to eat, I would just get busy. And I was able to keep that up for about 5 years. Speaking about my anxiety, my addiction, I would need to speak a little bit about shame because that is really what helped me come to an understanding of what complex trauma was. So after I'd lost all my weight, I realized I was still in shame, but then gaining it back, I had felt shame. I was trying to work on that. And at the same time, I was thinking about changing my career. And trying to do that, I had this little voice in the back of my head always telling me, "Oh, you're never going to be able to do that. Oh, you're not good enough." And all these messages going on. And I did recognize it as shame. So I did what everybody does. I Googled it. So as I started to Google about shame, looking for videos, I came across Tim Fletcher's series on shame. I started to listen and I understood the shame piece, but then he was talking about complex trauma. As he was talking about the complex trauma, light bulbs started to go on. After I watched that series, I started looking at, well, what is complex trauma? And another great series I listened to was the characteristics of trauma. And as he's going through as someone with complex trauma, these are the characteristics these people can experience. I started just checking them off. It's like, oh my goodness, I think that way. Oh my goodness, I see that way. Oh my goodness, my anxiety appears that way. So I was really starting to connect with the material, and I realized that perhaps some of my issues were related to complex trauma. And part of what complex trauma did for me was I was unable really to connect with myself and to connect with my emotions. So after going through quite a few videos, I realized the shame wasn't about my weight. The shame wasn't about changing me, changing jobs, changing this. It was really, for me, a result of my complex trauma and how I've internalized a lot of ideas around who I was. And so what I realized that my addictions were really about complex trauma. I was eating or using addictions to cope with my feelings. I was using it because my thoughts would kind of get out of hand. And so to just kind of stop my thinking, I had no clue that I had certain needs. And even if I had those needs, I had no clue how I was going to meet them outside of going to a thing, going to a person, going to food, because I never really learned how, for one, to determine what my needs were, and also how to meet those needs. So, what I've learned about complex trauma is that I was taught how to live in survival mode. And so, after taking the Lift Online program, I realized that if I'm going to get healthy, I'm going to have to learn to live outside of this survival mode that's always anxious, that's always in fear, that is always thinking too much. So I was going to need to learn new healthy ways to deal with everything that was going on inside of me. So I've learned that my issues aren't going to be solved by looking for things outside of myself. It's not by, oh, if I lose this weight, I won't feel shame. If I keep everything in my house in order, I'll be safe. If I show up for these people, I can make sure that I'll never be rejected. So a lot of those control issues don't work. What it really I've learned that I needed is I need to be conscious and aware of what I'm thinking so that I can correct my thinking behavior. I also need to learn to regulate my emotions. And if I get triggered, I now know when I am in fear, when I am anxious, to bring myself to a calmer state. And most importantly, I need to meet my needs. And if I never had learned how to get in touch with my emotions, I realized I never would have really understood what I needed. And it's in meeting those needs that I am starting to feel so much better in my relationships and the things that I do. And I understand why I'm doing things. Today, I no longer have the need to overeat unless I'm not taking care of my needs. I'm letting my emotions go all over the place, or I'm allowing my thinking to go all over the place. So I no longer need a diet to keep me on track. I do focus more on reparenting myself and noticing, when I'm off track, and when I am off track, I know now how to get myself back there. I know how to meet my needs. So this way of living is really relearning, and it is difficult, but totally worth the effort.
Well, I hope that was helpful for you. If you're struggling with an eating disorder, please reach out for help. Look into our LIFT program. I think you'll find it very, very helpful. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. Thank you so much for being with us. Hopefully it was helpful for you. Have a great weekend.